What is it about British comedy, do you think, that perhaps has a unique quality compared to European comedy of the same period? So, for example, Restoration comedy is clearly influenced by the French, but it's very much got its own flavour. What do you think that is? What do you think distinguishes it?
Sarcasm. I think British comedy has always revelled in hypocrisy, the idea of people not being quite what they seem. The last of the four plays, I just said to Graham and Penny, was like an Acheborn play, because it was that thing of people being caught in embarrassing social situations and having to explain them away with lies and then getting in deeper and deeper. And that's pure early Acheborn, when he was still primarily funny, and became too bogged down in social commentary. But that was interesting to see that. Also interesting to see it being done. I don't know how many of you here today are American or North American, but that was interesting seeing that, because that is a very British thing. But it also made me think of Larry David and Curb Your Enthusiasm and his obsession with, the golf club and how you behave in those sorts of situations. I think there's more in common with North American humour than we sometimes acknowledge on both sides. I think there's this. I think there's a myth that Americans don't do irony, but you do see it in all the classic movie comedies that came out of Hollywood.
This is something I actually want to come towards at the end, but we might as well address this now, is where has this tradition ended up? Because it's not in the theatre anymore. It's very much TV, isn't it? And it's something that the Americans are a master of.
Yes, TV and movies. And it stretches from those incredibly sophisticated comedies from the 1930s right through to the sort of broad comedy of Mel Brooks. Again, the classic Mel Brooks, not the later ones that get, a bit clunkier. But when you look at the producers, that's it's a work of genius. The original movie. But when you look back at those films from the 30s, and you think, well, that's straight. It's the equivalent of Noel Coward or Oscar Wilde. When you look at on the 20th century and you see the playing of people like John Barrymore, or in the Philadelphia Story with Cary Grant and Katharine Hepburn, the playing of high comedy isn't necessarily purely a British thing.
No.
It surprised me the first time I went to the States. I did a show in New York in the early 80s, and I'd never been to New York before, and people were saying, oh, you must go and see this, you must go and see that. And they were taking me to see things that were regarded as European classics. So I was going to see things like Medea, and I was fascinated to see American actors attempting to do them English. And I thought, why? Because Medea isn't set in England. No. Just do it American. And you look at someone, getting back to someone like Katharine Hepburn, when she plays, and of course it is a sort of high comedy, in the movie of The Line in Winter, where she plays Peter O'Toole's wife, Eleanor of Aquitaine. When you watch that film, she has an American accent,
yes.
But it doesn't matter, because she's thinking European up there,
yes.
And so you forget that the accent isn't accurate. I mean, Henry probably would have spoken French anyway, so it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. So I know that you're all, those of you who are North American here, are doing lots of voice classes and things, presumably for when you need to do something in an English accent to play an English role. But never be frightened of doing high comedy with American accents, because you can do it as well as anyone.
Do you think that would work, though, with something like Congreve?
I think it would.
Right.
It wouldn't work with Wilde.
No. Or Coward.
Or Coward.
No.
It wouldn't work with the more contemporary ones, because I don't know if it's just because there's more distance, but there's more artifice in restoration, and part of that allows you to be what you want, and to use different accents.
Well, do you think? I mean, I've never seen it, but to see something like Congreve, Where the World, done in an accent from the deep south.
Yeah, I think the other reason that restoration would work with the North American accent is because it's a different sort of snobbery in those plays. The snobbery is about money. It's all about who's got money. People are chasing the wife who's got the dowry, or the women are chasing the husband that's got the money, and they're cuckolding their miserable husband who's got money because they want sex from the young buck. But by the time you get to Wilde and the late Victorian comedies of Wilde and Pinero, people like that, the snobbery is all about class in a much more complicated way, which I think is very specifically of that period.
And also, it's also metropolitan. It's not just Wilde's snobbery is of a period and of a place as well, is it not?
Yes, absolutely. Because they look down their noses. They look down their noses. The characters that Wilde is satirising look down their noses because he's poking fun at social snobbery, although he was a social snob himself, but he was satirising it. Those characters are all looking down their noses at people who come from the country, people who come from abroad. You've got in Lady Windermere's Fan, they laugh because someone comes from Australia. They look down their noses because someone has been born into the family of a tradesman, and they don't come from a long line of aristocrats, whatever. So that's something that's quite tricky then to translate to a different geography.
Yes, I think so.
Whereas with restoration, it's about sex and money.
Do you think there's an appeal? Restoration plays are revived from time to time, some more successfully than others. Who do you think are the successful authors that are revived, and why? Think of some of your own productions that you've directed, and why have you chosen that? Why have you gone for that?
All comedies work well in their period, and then they find favour again in certain periods. I mean, people forget that Shakespeare was out of fashion for a very long time, and then came back with the Victorians. Because with the early Victorians, that was when they were starting to get a bit puritanical, and you had all those Bowdlerised versions of Shakespeare. There was even one I remember I found one on the shelves of my school library, Bowdlerised Macbeth, where Lady Macbeth's speech about "come, murdering ministers, take my breasts for gall," all of that was all gone. You couldn't have any of that.
It was considered that women might pick this book up and then have a fainting fit when we were so appalled and horrified at Shakespeare.
Or do something worse.
You know, I mean...
No, but... and all,
you think so the idea was it would give women ideas? Is that
exactly. Just as today people say, you know, you've got to ban pornography because it makes people into sex fiends. It's the same thing, really. But which ones have lasted and why? Well, what does the restoration come from? It comes after the 11 years of Cromwell, the interregnum, with, you know, no theatre, no music, no mince pies.
No laughing, nothing.
No, nothing. You know, so it was basically like living under the Taliban for over a decade, and people all thought, "Is this what we voted for?" Of course, not all of them did. But after that, it was just an explosion of people saying, "Thank God, you know, we can now be human beings again." And I think that what you get in those early restoration plays is just an incredible expression of humanity, in all its filth and glorious, you know, naughtiness. And people just acknowledging that we're flesh and blood. And that's why they worked. It's why for a long time they were out of fashion because they were just too rude, and the only ones you could do were the much later ones, like the Sheridans and Goldsmith, and the early ones like the Country Wife were you couldn't really touch for a long time, and if you did them, then they had to be quite heavily censored.
Talk to me about the Country Wife, because you've directed the Country Wife, and it is very modern in many ways, isn't it, for an audience? Yeah.
Well, it's very modern because the women are all sexual beings with their own desires. I mean, it is the rudest of all the restorations, I think, of the ones we know anyway. And it's got the problem for a lot of modern audiences might be that the central character is totally reprehensible because of the way that he cuckolds all the husbands and seduces all of these women without any kind of personal sense of responsibility. But you have to then accept that the women in the play are all gagging for it. And so he's not molesting them, they're all chasing after him. When I did it, I was slightly concerned about the audience thinking, I'm not sure I can identify with this man. And I've always had the attitude that no old play is Holy Scripture. You know, these things are not carved in stone like the Ten Commandments. If something doesn't work 100% for a modern audience, then you can tweak it. As long as the original play still exists out there in a published form and people are still doing it, then I think you can tweak it to make it work, and you can lose a joke that means nothing to a modern audience. And what I did, it was for different reasons, for several different reasons. In The Country Wife, you've got a character of a quack doctor who conspires with Horner, who's the hero, stroke villain, to pretend that he is impotent, that he's been made impotent by having venereal disease. And they have these very long scenes that keep cropping up in the play that to me slow down the action, where he's telling the quack what he's going to do next. And what I did was I cut the quack and I had Horner talking directly to the audience with a prologue and then with asides. They were still his lines. I wrote a new prologue, but then the prologues often weren't written by the authors. They were written by the actors or the manager at that theatre. So I thought that was okay. And then I gave his dialogue to the quack, to Horner, to speak directly to the audience. And what this did was it made the audience complicit. And I thought at the time it was very like Richard III. Richard III is a mass murderer, but the audience are with him the whole time when you see a production, because he's talking to you and says, now this is what I'm going to do next. And so you follow him because he's made you an accomplice. And so with The Country Wife, I made the audience the accomplice of Horner to see how much he could get away with. But it is absolute filth. And you sometimes think, how on earth did they get away with it? But at the same time as The Country Wife was being performed in the theatres, the Earl of Rochester was writing court masques for Charles II, which were filthier than anything you've done today.
Can you give us an example? I know you can.
I can't quote. I can only remember one of his sort of short poems from one. I can't remember which play it's from, and it's something like, that pattern of virtue, her grace of Clevelands, has swallowed more pricks than the ocean has sands. But with rubbing and scrubbing, so rough does it grow, it's fit now for nothing but Signor Dildo. And that was being done at court, and they had masks where they all paraded with giant phalluses.
Actually, that is going back to the Greek original.
To Lysistrata.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. And there was a film, The Libertine, with Johnny Depp playing the. I don't know if you've seen it, which is. And Charles II got very upset about that, didn't he?
Yeah.
He would had enough of being lampooned because he tolerated everything. He brought women back to the stage, The language of the country wife is very modern and flowing, and what I think English comedy is also doing at this period is it got completely moved away from all the rhyming couplets and blank verse, which French comedy is still doing, is it not?
Yeah, they're still doing everything in Alexandrines, which are even more unwieldy than the blank verse, because they're that much longer and much, to the English ear, a lot clunkier. They're beautiful. I've done plays by Corneille and Racine, but no. Again, it's a sense of liberation, and also having women on stage for the first time. I think that was the other thing that liberated the sexual explicitness in these plays, because when they were boy actors, although I think Graham has an opinion about whether or not there were women in Shakespeare's plays.
Suzman, actually.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It was all romantic love. It was courtly love, and although there is a lot of sex in Shakespeare, and the sex underpins all of those romantic comedies, they're not explicit in the same way that the Restoration plays are, and you can do that once you've got real women on stage, I think.
You were saying something about Wilde earlier to me before all our good students came in, about how Wilde, when you play it so that the young guys are sexually, madly, deeply, lustfully in love with the young women, it does something, doesn't it?
Yeah, it gives a frisson to everything. People are often, again, it's the terrible sort of traditional idea of presenting all English drama. It's the curse of Shakespeare and Sheridan and Wilde, is that people think that you have to strike an attitude and then deliver things in a particular sort of voice.
John Gilbert's
but it's just nonsense, because unless there's something going on underneath, it's meaningless, and you still see terrible productions. I know it's not what we're dealing with today, but of Shakespeare in particular, where there's absolutely nothing going on in here. It's all just, I'm making a lovely sound and I'm looking pretty, and you just want to say, Romeo wants to screw her, and this girl is having a sexual awakening in Romeo and Juliet, and in As You Like It. I mean, one of the things about the whole thing being set in the forest means that these people are suddenly, they're not bestial, but you know what I mean. Their natural instincts are coming through.
And talk about the dream.
Oh, the dream as well. I was saying As You Like It, but in the dream, yes. I mean, it's incredibly sexual. You've got the great thing. Funnily enough, best production of Midsummer Night's Dream I've ever seen, apart from my own, is the the Hollywood movie from the 1930s.
Vivian Leigh in it?
No, it's Olivia de Havilland, Dick Powell, Jimmy Cagney plays Bottom. He's the best Bottom there's ever been. Mickey Rooney as Puck. No, it's a wonderful film. It's the famous Max Reinhardt directed it, and it's a wonderful film. And you think that's terrific. That's really energized playing. And maybe some purists might say, well, the verse isn't perfect, but the important thing is the essence is there. And in that play, and in Midsummer Night's Dream, the women, when Hermia goes into the forest, she's saying, I'm not going to lie next to you because I know what you'll get up to. So clearly, these people are there for he's taken her into the forest for more than one reason.
Well, the forest represents
exactly
nature and all of that. Coming back to her high comedy, now you had a theory about why The Rivals is so good and so easy to revive, and it was to do with the quickness.
I've done both. I personally prefer The Rivals, and strange enough, when you work on these plays, it's like when people say, when they're trying to identify the lost Shakespeares and the Apocrypha, and academics try to do it. You can't do it academically. It's when you stand up and start speaking it. That's when you know whether it's Shakespeare or not. That's when you know whether something is written by an author. And with The Rivals, Sheridan was broke, and he wasn't a playwright. He was a politician, and he had to make some money in a great hurry. And he thought, oh, people writing plays, it's money for old rope, and if you write a good one, you can make a lot of money very quickly. And that's how he wrote The Rivals. He wrote it in a great flurry of energy and desperation, writing to a deadline, like you would a sitcom today. If you're writing an episode of Will and Grace or something, you know, you're writing to a deadline. And that's why it has this sort of energy that drives through it, and it seems to be totally spontaneous. When I did The School for Scandal, which is still a great play, it's a marvellous play, but there's a greater amount of artifice in the play. It's much more self-conscious. What's interesting is that the actors, I had a lot of the same actors, they found The School for Scandal much harder to learn. And I think people find The Way of the World hard to learn. I think when things are more contrived, it's harder to get them to sink in. When something is really spontaneous and feels like natural speech, albeit heightened, it's easier for people to memorize it because it fits into what makes sense in our brains with the way we communicate normally. So School for Scandal, yeah, it's a much more artificial piece. And I think that's why, for me, it's not quite as much fun. There's something sort of rumbustious about The Rivals.
But don't you think comedy of manners, restoration comedy, high comedy, that artifice is certainly part of its appeal?
Yes.
And in Will and Grace, which I have to say, I don't know very well, the two couples aren't there really in it. One of the women actually got a very high squeaky voice. I don't know who that is.
They know
that
better than we do.
Pure.
Yeah.
Well, that character could come from any of those high comedies, couldn't it?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, they're not stock characters, but they're situations. I mean, people say, you know, there are only so many plots in the world, and they keep being reinvented. Well, The Country Wife is almost the same plot as the School for Scandal. And both are taken from Molière. So they're all...
Who in turn has taken it either from Plautus or Terence.
Exactly.
Who in turn have taken it from Menander.
Yeah. And we just constantly reinvent these things, and that's why I was saying that you're seeing shades of Ayckbourn in these things. And it was the second play. What was it? It reminded me of something that we saw today, and I scribbled it down. What was it? Oh, no, I know what it was. It was the word play. It was the brilliant wordplay of the repeated thing about the ball, and I kept thinking of the Court Jester, the Danny Kaye movie. The vessel with the pestle has the pellet with the poison, and the chalice from the palace has the brew that is true. I make these references very casually to a sea of young faces, and yet I know that not enough of you will be familiar with your own cultural heritage. And I'm saying this never having met any of you before, because I'm constantly frustrated by the fact that people don't look at, I mean, you can't look at old stage productions, but you can look at old films, and you can look at old actors, and I can't stress how valuable it is. I know that our acting styles change and the styles of the writing change, but Peter Bogdanovich, great American director, wrote a fascinating book of essays about encounters with different great movie stars, some of whom he'd worked with, some not. But in the introduction, he says it frustrates him when he speaks to film students in America, when he says, "Oh, this is a very James Cagney role," and then they say, "Who's James Cagney?" And he sort of clutches his head in despair. The same is true with English students who, if you say John Gielgud or Ralph Richardson, some of them wouldn't even know who Laurence Olivier is. I think it's very important to look at these people, and you learn so much from them, and you'll be surprised. You may think it's an alien acting style, but you'd be amazed at what you pick up from them. And I say that the play with all the short play with all the wordplay in it was pure Vessel with the Pestle.
Yes, it was.
And it was also like, I know that none of you will know this, there was an English comic actor in the 1930s called Wilde, who made dozens of farcical films, and they were stuffed with things like that. And also you still get that in panto today, in English panto. So that stuff comes through, not necessarily in a direct line, but it weaves its way through, and you will still get people doing those gags in British pantomime. You get gags when you do Aladdin, not very PC gags, but about Chinese names being repeated. Is that Mr. Who? Who is Mr. Who? That sort of thing. It's just incredibly complicated wordplay, which has got nothing to contribute in terms of comedy apart from the joy of playing around with words.
Yes, which is a defining aspect of comedy.
And they tickle the audience to the point where they become slightly hysterical, and it's inexplicable.
Yes. Can I ask you, I was asked at a party, someone was asking me what I was doing, and I was talking about our lovely D's here, and looking at high comedy and restoration comedy. And she was a well-known actress, and she said, well, what's the point of teaching students restoration comedy? What's the point? Why? I mean,
it teaches you to be brave. I will say, one or two of you did it once or twice, and somebody once said to me when I was working on a restoration, and I thought, no, he's right. When you do asides, they've got to be so clear. And obviously, if you're putting together a 15-minute skit, you've not got the time to block these things with a director who's saying that one isn't clear and that one is, but where you position people on the stage, all that sort of thing. But if ever you find yourself in a play, a restoration in particular, but you do get it in Shakespeare, but it's slightly different, you do have to be so bold with the aside. I thought it was great when you did the thing where you referred to the fact that you were making asides. That was very funny. Pure Mel Brooks, that sort of thing, you know, of sort of addressing the audience and then making a comment on the fact that someone has addressed an audience. But with an aside, one person did it, the girl in that, I think it was the second play, did that thing of stepping out front and then stepping back into the action. And I think sometimes you've got to be that bold. It depends on what the style is in which you're playing the scene, the level of energy you're putting into the scene. Sometimes you can just do that and come back, but a lot of the time it's possible and much funnier if you do talk and then say, he doesn't know what I'm talking about, and then you come back in. So be brave, and that's what restoration teaches you.
In restoration times, you could pay to go and sit on the stage at the side, and the asides would be delivered to you, so you could pay to be part of the play.
Oh yeah, in the same way that in lots of Broadway musicals, when you get a star performer, like when Zero Mostel did the original of Fiddler on the Roof, apparently he came out of the action all the time and spoke to individual people in the audience in the same way any stand-up comedian would do. And whether that was right in Fiddler, I don't know, but it's something that people do. It can slow down the action horribly if it's not scripted. Talking of the stage boxes, this isn't really connected to restoration. There was an actor playing Hamlet once, and halfway through one of the big soliloquies, there was an aristocrat in one of the stage boxes who spotted a friend on the opposite side and just walked across, and Hamlet stopped and said, "Sir, how dare you? I'm trying to earn my living." And the aristocrat was so outraged, he drew his sword and demanded an apology, and the actor had to apologize, and the man carried his way to the other box. I mean, how dare an actor speak to a member of the audience like that? I mean, in a way, he was right. You know, they've paid your wages. They've got the right to complain if they're not happy.
But restoration comedy teaches you other things as well. It gives you, what does it give you? Authority.
It gives you authority because of that boldness that you need, because you have to be unembarrassable by all of the fairly explicit sexuality in it. That was what was great about a lot of the playing that you were doing today, is that you were playing these things, considering you come from a generation which has all sorts of issues with what is acceptable and what isn't acceptable in speech, and what is acceptable and isn't acceptable in how we discuss things to do with sexuality. I thought you all showed a remarkable lack of inhibition, which was reassuring to know that people haven't lost that. I think, to be absolutely frank, it would be difficult to do some of these restoration plays at the moment, but their time is coming, just as it came after a decade of Oliver Cromwell and no singing, no theatre, no dancing, and no Christmas puddings. Yeah, its time will come, and that's why you need to have this. You do get it from playing Shakespeare in the right sort of venues, I think. You know, if you play Shakespeare if you play Shakespeare in the open air, then you have to be grand in the way that you play it. But then to me, all acting is about confidence and fearlessness. That's what charisma is, just coming onto the stage and the audience relaxing. A lady whose memorial service was last week, who has been here and spoken to students before, Fenella Fielding, I saw in a production of The Country Wife, which was agonizingly bad. But when she came on as Lady Fidget, you saw, I mean, I was about 10 rows back, you saw everybody's shoulders in the audience go down because they suddenly felt comfortable, because she was a star performer who just walked on stage and owned it and was just very comfortable and relaxed. On which point, I would say some of the humour was lost today because people were rushing. That always indicates that you're panicking and thinking, I've got to get through this, and the only way to make something funny is to gabble it. It needs to be pacey, but do be careful that you don't let your tongue run away with you. Just always be aware of that. Again, that's a bit, I'm being very picky because you only had, a couple of weeks to put together.
And all their other
very,
stuff
very good.
Well.
I mean, I say all 4 of them were very impressive. But I'd say as a tip, always think, is this too fast for the audience? Because I lost plot points a couple of times because I wasn't quite hearing. Always remember there'll be people in the audience whose hearing isn't quite as good as yours. And the acoustics will not always be what you expect them to be. Don't patronise the audience, but always think they need to follow this. Otherwise, they will get bored. That's when people get bored, when they can't follow the plot. But the playing of the comedy was done with such relish.
Yes,
that's the thing.
It was lovely.
It's relish. But yes, I think these plays, restoration plays, they still have a lot to say to modern audiences. And I think sometimes you need to tweak them slightly to make them relevant and lose a gag here or tighten one up there. I'm possibly the only person who put more dirty jokes into The Country Wife when I did it, but nobody noticed. It's little things become obscure to a modern audience. The odd reference, and you get it, of course, in Shakespeare, all of the low comedy stuff, half of it probably not even written by Shakespeare, but by the clowns, all with topical references. I mean, if someone writes a play now and there are endless references to Robert Mueller or Mike Pence, in 100 years' time, nobody will know what those jokes mean, even Americans. So, sometimes you have to be careful with these things.
We looked at, moving on from Sheridan, we moved obviously to Wilde and Coward, and as more recent exponents of this particular art, what would you say are the essential differences between Coward and Wilde? Because Coward does follow on from Wilde, doesn't he?
He does. Again, it's the English obsession with class, and the fascinating thing there is that Coward people think of as another Oscar Wilde, but of course he didn't come from the same background as Oscar Wilde. Coward was arguably genteel working class. I think some people might say very lower middle class. And again, that's one of those things that English people might argue about and baffle everybody else. But he was not from a particularly well-off family, and he certainly wasn't aristocracy. And yet all of his plays, well, not all of them, but the ones that people know best are about people being incredibly sophisticated and successful or aristocratic or whatever. And funnily enough, his lower class characters, he's always slightly patronizing about them, which is fascinating when you look at a play like this, Happy Breed, because that's the class that he came from. As I say, I would call genteel working class, you'd call lower middle class. He's, I say, slightly patronising, but the high comedy of Private Lives and Hay Fever.
But it's the language, it's the rhythm of the language, and this is something that goes right back to, say, Congreve and Wycherley, Vanbrugh, all of these writers. It is the pace and the rhythm of the language, which is partly
it's musical.
What provides the comedy, isn't it? Yes,
it's musical. I think they all had a sense of musicality, which is why I think all actors, should, even if they don't like musicals, should watch musicals and watch opera, because it's fascinating to see how language is used in conjunction with music.
Well, that brings me quite nicely onto Mapp and Lucia, the musical, which
Yes.
Yes. Mapp and Lucia, written by E.F. Benson, who was a writer in the 20s, whose father was the Archbishop of Canterbury, and whose mother had a famous lesbian affair in the 20s and ran off with some other woman. His brother became a Roman Catholic priest, and he wrote these they are high comedy novels, aren't they? They're very theatrical novels that lend themselves very beautifully to dramatisation. And there was a wonderful dramatisation, which, if you can look it up, with Prunella Scales and Geraldine McEwen as Mapp and Lucia, these two very county women, English county women, living not far from the sea in competition with each other over who was really the grande dame of the little village. And they are hilariously funny. Who adapted that?
For the TV series?
No, for your musical.
Oh, well, I adapted my musical and wrote the libretto.
Right.
The TV is, I think, Gerald Savoury, and very good adaptation as well.
Very good.
And extremely well done, because, again, all people who understand high comedy, and all those people like Prunella Scales, Nigel Hawthorne as Georgie, and Geraldine McEwen. I saw Geraldine McEwen being very good as Lady Wishfort in The Way of the World at the National, in a production I didn't enjoy, but she was marvellous. So they understood how far to take it without it becoming...
Caricature?
Without it becoming a caricature. It was still believable. How they made it believable was they made you believe that this was how people behaved in this world, this particular world. Ralph Richardson once said something brilliant about Shakespeare. He said, when you do blank verse, it's not about making blank verse sound like ordinary speech. It's about persuading the audience that blank verse is ordinary speech. That's a perfectly natural way for your character to be talking. And with that that TV adaptation of Mapp and Lucia, they persuaded you that it was totally normal for them to be talking in this ludicrous way.
Yes. I think you'll find it very entertaining.
Yeah, you can get it on YouTube still. Mapp with two P's.
If you like English eccentric, bizarre comedy, it will be right up your street.
Yeah.
What's your favourite comedy?
My favourite...
Your favourite comedy, what's the favourite comedy you've directed in Comedy of Manners high comedy tradition?
I have to say, somebody asked me recently, what's your favourite play, that boring thing, and he did say, what's your favourite comedy as well, and I said, including Shakespeare. And I said, well, it's such an impossible question, but if you said your favourite Shakespeare comedy, it has to be Midsummer Night's Dream. But if you said, what's your favourite comedy, full stop, it would probably be The Importance of Being Earnest. And I steered away from directing it for years because I thought everybody knows every line in this play, English audiences anyway. But eventually I did it, and it was a joy, because that's the thing about great writing. You will always find something new. You don't necessarily have to set it in a different period or put it on pogo sticks or on trampolines or have everybody cross-dressing. You just find new things in it by looking into the text and thinking, you know, what motivates these characters. And getting back to what I was saying at the beginning, with Wilde in particular, people think that they're all speaking with the same voice because they all speak in this heightened way. And you think, oh, they're all speaking with Oscar Wilde's voice. But they are still characters. When you look at them, they've all got very clear objectives, very clear motivations. And it frustrates me if I see a production of The Importance where Algernon and Jack, stroke Ernest, are sort of interchangeable because they're very different characters. Because Jack is a bit of a stuffed shirt, and Algie is a naughty boy. He's a very naughty boy. And Cicely is very, very knowing. She knows exactly what she's up to, and exactly how to get it. She's no less canny than Gwendolen. But people just play them sometimes in this very superficial way. And what makes them really funny is getting, what is the prime mover? What is it? What is the impetus behind characters in these plays? That's what makes them funny, making them people who really want something. You know, Algernon really wants Cecily. He's really desperate to have her.
What you were saying about the erotic charge.
Well, when I did it,
it's missing sometimes.
When I did the play, I said to the actress playing Gwendolen, she talks about having to marry a man called Ernest in a way that sounds like it's a fetish. It can't be described in any other way. She says, he has to be called Ernest, otherwise I can't do it. And she says it produces vibrations. I mean, everything. I mean, there's a lot of nonsense talked about what Wilde was saying in the plays, in what certain words really meant in slang. Some of it's true, some of it isn't. But when you think about, you know, what she goes on about, how she can only have this man called Ernest, you sense that she gets a thrill every time the name is spoken, that it does something to her. Lots of people get turned on by people's voices. Lots of people get turned on by things that are spoken. Lots of people, when they with their lovers, want someone to talk dirty to them or call them by a pet name or something. And so I said this to the actress, and whenever she said, I need to be with a man called Ernest, you got the sense that she was actually having a bit of a thrill down below every time she said it, and the audience loved it. It doesn't need to be coarse, it doesn't need to be out there, but as long as the actress is thinking it, then the audience get it. And I think you've got to remember, as I say, these characters are flesh and blood. They want to get that money, they want to get that title, they want to get that sex. That they've all got objectives. That's what drives comedy. The stakes must always be high. And even in that last sketch where it was about people being found out having to take low-paid jobs in a country club, you know, the stakes are high because that's why I said it's Acheborn, because it's suddenly social status. Oh my God, my neighbours are going to know that I've got no money. And in our world, those stakes are important.
Can I ask you, because we spoke about this earlier, is in the theatre in this country, nobody really is writing any new plays. And where's it all gone then?
Television.
Yeah.
American television.
Mm-hmm.
Ah, yes.
Exactly what we were talking about. The son was saying, why do you keep looking in that direction?
Yeah.
You know, and when she looked at the camera. So
Yeah.
just remind-
It's marvellous. But that tradition comes from the thing of referring to the fact that someone is referring to the audience, that was people like Mel Brooks taking the idea and running with it. You actually get, I think it might be in Blazing Saddles, Harvey Korman soliloquizing and then saying to the camera, "Why am I asking you?" It's, but now you get it in the better American, well, across the board American TV drama now is very, very good. But it's been there in American sitcom for a long time, the wisecracking, fast-paced stuff. What it sometimes lacks is development of character. And that's what you get in the classic British sitcoms of the 1960s and 70s. And none of you will be familiar, I'm sure, with Steptoe and Son, which is like each half-hour episode is like watching The Cherry Orchard. It really is.
As imagined by Joe Orton, though, a little
Yes,
bit, isn't it?
yeah.
It's a grotesquerie. It's a grotesque
the
version.
tragedy of never being able to escape a hideous situation, a domestic situation you're trapped in, and yet finding the most wonderful laughs all the way through. But ultimately, the story is tragic. But it's pure Beckett. I was in a production of Endgame, and when people said, "Oh my God, I'm not sure I understand Endgame. I don't know if I'll come and see it," and I said, "It's Steptoe and Son. It's about, and it's a comedy. It's about an old man and his son, and he won't let the son leave because he needs someone to look after him. And the son's always saying, 'I'm going to leave,' just like the three sisters are, 'I'm going to Moscow, I'm doing it tomorrow,' and they never do. Again, we're talking about a different sort of comedy there, though, because in Restoration, people get what they want. The bad are punished, and the what is it in the Importance? The bad
and the good end happily, the bad unhappily. That is the meaning of fiction.
Yes,
Absolutely.
Yeah. Brilliant line.
What time are we on? Just out of interest.
10 past, we should finish.
Right.
Oh,
in that case,
talking too much.
Thank you very much for coming to listening to Peter today.
Oh. And thank you for entertaining me. All four of them were very, very clever.
Yeah, they were
very
lovely.
clever.
Thank you so much. Thank you, everybody. Thank you.
Thank you.